Welcome to the New Books Network.
Good day. Welcome to New Books in History, a podcast channel on New Books Network. My name is Dr. Charles Katia. I'm a host on the channel. And today we are pleased and indeed honored to have with us Mr. Edward Luce of the Financial Times. Mr. Luce is the United States editor and a columnist for the Financial Times. And today we are discussing his book, Zbig, The Life of Zbigniew Brzezinski, published by Avid Reader Press. Welcome, Edward Luce.
Great to be with you.
Mr. Luce, why did you write this book?
Because it hadn't been written before. There's a huge gap there that somebody as significant as Zbigniew Brzezinski didn't have a full life biography, at least in the English language. And because I was given the materials, the diaries that he kept when he was National Security Advisor, which were really compelling diaries, and the family did not have any strings attached to that offer, namely that they wouldn't be editing or redacting or seeing this book before anybody else. So once I started reading the diaries, I became really quite hooked and immersed in his life and felt that this would be a worthwhile endeavor, which it is more than proved to be.
But at the same time, this is not an authorized biography, correct?
It's not authorized in the sense that they don't get to have any say, but it is unrestricted, meaning I had access to everything I needed.
What was Brzezinski's family background, and how important was it for him?
Well, he was born in Poland, and in 1928, and that was hugely important to him. Of course, this was a very brief flowering of the Polish Second Republic, which was set up at the Treaty of Versailles in 1919 and was extinguished in 1939 when the World War II began, with the sort of pincer Soviet Nazi invasion and division of Poland. And so for Brzezinski, the sense of lost nationhood, what I call amputated nationhood, was a very compelling sort of motivating force in his early life. By that point, his dad, who was a diplomat, had been given a posting as Polish consul general in Montreal. So the family were out of harm's way, but the sense of Polishness is very strong in Brzezinski's early life in particular.
In your introduction, you mentioned that Brzezinski, like a lot of other people in the foreign policy community, or for that matter, in academia, was not a person who either suffered fools gladly or tried to ingratiate himself. I suppose the big contrast in that respect would be Henry Kissinger. Would you say that this particular traits were due to the fact, or partly due to the fact that his background, I think on both sides, of his mother and father's, was in what was called in Polish fraught, which means more or less loosely nobleman. Would you say that's correct?
I'd say that's part of it. I mean, that category, Szlachta, of Polish nobility is not really comparable to other European countries' definition of nobility, because they account for about 1/10 of Poland's population. They're not necessarily big landowners, but they were sort of the first citizens of Poland. Poland was actually used to, when it was the Lithuanian Poland Commonwealth, used to elect its king from amongst the ranks of Szlachta, and so there is a sort of political fierceness and of pride in that class, but it doesn't necessarily mean aristocratic in the sense that you would describe it, say, in France or Britain, where aristocrats are probably only about 1% of the population, but never elected their king. So yes, there's a fierce sense of Polish nationhood, but it's kind of a civic idea of nationhood that's remarkably ancient by the standards of other European countries. And yes, Brzezinski was very much of that background. But I think the broader sense of having watched his nation pillaged and razed once again from the comfortable distance, but excruciatingly anguished distance also of Montreal during the Second World War, that there was always something of the uncompromising, what I sort of think of as a Polish cavalry charge in how Brzezinski dealt with people who disagreed with him. He really gave them no quarter. He was a tough character.
Why did he end up at Harvard University?
So he'd been at McGill in Montreal, where he did his a very sort of seminal a postgraduate thesis called Russo-Soviet Nationalism, which sort of arrived with a bang in this very fledgling world of Sovietology, and he'd learned Russian, and this sort of established him at a very young age, 21, 22, as a Sovietologist of note. But he wanted to leave Canada, not because he disliked Canada, but because it just wasn't a big enough vehicle. He wanted not only to succeed in American academia, Harvard being his overwhelming first choice, but also to use that as a springboard to get into a Washington position of influence, where he could help among other countries, but he was never shy of declaring his ambitions, where he could help liberate Poland from Soviet tutelage. And he made that plain. It was his ambition, really, from his late adolescence.
How was Brzezinski so able and so quickly to join the American foreign policy elite?
Sovietology was a young discipline, but it was also an overwhelming priority in not just in the universities, the so-called Cold War university that we now sort of look at it, call it, but in Washington, there was a great demand for knowledge of what was going on behind the Iron Curtain and how things worked in Moscow. And Brzezinski's, near fluency with Russian, the fact that he got Harvard travel grants to go behind the Iron Curtain, including around the Soviet Union, and including to his native Poland, meant that he was unusually sort of well informed. There were a lot of Sovietologists, very eminent ones, who didn't speak Russian, for example. And Brzezinski, had both that sort of knowledge, but also that urgency. There was a sense of his sort of life, in some respects, is a straight arrow. You know exactly where he's going. He declares it very young. And he wanted to, I guess, convert academic credibility and reputation into political influence. And so that's what he set about doing with remarkable effectiveness. But he didn't really get into any sort of position of political influence until the Lyndon Baines Johnson administration, where he had a period, an 18-month period at the State Department.
On the policy planning staff, right?
Exactly, on the policy planning staff. And where, LBJ was increasingly distracted by the war in Vietnam, but his staff, his White House staff, with the exception of his national security advisor, Walt Rostow, who was Vietnam obsessed and believed America was just about to win the whole time, everyone else realized LBJ needed other things to focus on in foreign policy. He needed wins. And the focus of the Cold War had moved from the Iron Curtain in Europe to the jungles of Southeast Asia. And, Brzezinski managed to inveigle a policy of what he called, and he'd been touting as an academic at Columbia, where he'd moved, of peaceful engagement with Eastern Europe, of trying to sort of stoke ideas of civic pride and independence in countries like Poland, that he believed would be the key to unlocking Soviet power. But there was a sort of paradoxical approach there, because it had to be non-threatening to Moscow for capitals like Budapest and Warsaw, etc., to feel able to strengthen their ties, economic and cultural and people-to-people ties with the West. But that's what he got LBJ to give a speech on this, and it was actually remarkably effective and somewhat unethical the way he persuaded the White House that LBJ had to give this speech.
Reading your book, one gets the impression that Brzezinski was Henry Kissinger's doppelganger. Why was that the case, and why was, as opposed to say the Ferguson biography of Kissinger, it's notable that Brzezinski gets much less mentioned in the pre-1969 period than Kissinger gets in your book?
That's true. I mean, maybe that will change with volume 2 of that Kissinger Ferguson biography. But I guess a lot of people saw Brzezinski as Salieri to Kissinger's Mozart. And I think Kissinger did too. Kissinger was several years ahead of Brzezinski. He was older than him. He had become this indispensable, I guess, factotum, not more than factotum, advisor and impresario for Nelson Rockefeller. And Nelson Rockefeller really sponsored Kissinger's rise. And he'd achieved fame very young with his book, A World Restored, about the Congress of Vienna and Metternich, etc. Brzezinski was behind him in terms of reaching any sort of serious political influence. Kissinger, got the job with Nixon in 1968. Brzezinski had to wait until Carter won in 1976 to get the equivalent job. But I think that this sense of Mozart Salieri I think that's off. I think that's wrong. I think if you look at each of the Kissinger and Brzezinski's Cold War strategies, Brzezinski's was more effective and had more impact. And I mean, we can go into that if you like. That's really core to this biography. But the old and famous Isaiah Berlin, the British 20th century philosopher, the idea that there are two types of statesmen. There's the hedgehog and the fox being tactically cunning, versatile, etc., and the hedgehog knowing one big thing. Well, Berlin wrote that about Churchill. Churchill knew one big thing. He got everything else wrong. He got India wrong. He got Ireland wrong. He got the gold standard wrong and the Dardanelles, etc. But he got the Nazis right when all the foxes around him did not. And I think Brzezinski is really the hedgehog in this equation, because he got the Soviets right. He understood, as he had laid out in that McGill thesis back in 1950, that the Soviets had what he called an Achilles heel, which was its suppressed nations within the USSR, the Ukrainians, Georgians, Tajiks, Kazakhs, etc., and also the so-called captive nations of the Warsaw Pact, such as Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and that stimulating these suppressed nationalisms or suppressed nations and exploiting the fact that they didn't feel Soviet. In his words, he famously said that there is no such thing as the Soviet language. Nobody speaks Soviet. Was, in his view, the key to unraveling the Soviet Union. And indeed, if you look at that through line from 1950 to the end of the Cold War in 1989, you'll see that it really ends on June the 4th, 1989, when Solidarity, the Polish trade union movement, is allowed to contest elections by the communist regime and sweeps them. And at that point, both Gorbachev and the Polish leader Jaruzelski say, okay, my number's up. We will allow them to form a government. That was really the end of of the Cold War. and when the Soviets agreed to cede their monopoly on power, and that was really sort of foretold, which is why I use the word prophet in the subtitle, Great Power Prophet, about Brzezinski. That was really sort of foretold. That had been his strategy all along, that it wouldn't be Moscow that would end the Cold War. It would be its satellites. That was the key to unraveling the Soviet bloc. And so in that regard, I think Brzezinski was very much closer to the truth than Kissinger, who believed that the Soviet Union would be a permanent feature of the landscape. And because of his fascination with sort of great power politics, wasn't too interested in the satellite countries, let alone the sort of Soviet republics behind the Iron Curtain. I guess that's quite a long answer, but it's pretty central to Brzezinski's life, and his rivalry with Kissinger is, of course, it spans decades. It's what I call a frenemyship, because they loved talking to each other, and they met for dinner even when they were sort of in really tense moments. They would still meet for dinner.
Why would you disagree with the characterization by people such as Elizabeth Drew of the New Yorker that Brzezinski was a man of current fashion and not a thinker of real substance?
Well, for what I've just laid out, I mean, this was a position he held, which I think was borne out by events for 4 decades. That's not how somebody who's twisting and turning with the latest fashion behaves. Now, it might well be true that he had, and it is true that, Brzezinski had a sort of a journalistic side to him, and he picked up and tried to sort of capture other trends with neologisms like technotronic. He wrote a book called Between Two Ages, the Technotronic Revolution, which gave the impression he was always grasping for the zeitgeist, and Kissinger made this observation too. But I think it's a little bit unfair to say he was a sort of slave to fashion. I think the core of his life's work, the Sovietology, was remarkably unchanging, and I think prescient in its scholarship.
Why the Trilateral Commission?
That you could also probably fit into the Kissinger-Brzezinski rivalry box, if you like. He wanted to set up something that was an alternative to the Bilderberg meetings, where Kissinger was really a star, and Brzezinski had attended them, but he found his own Rockefeller, David, the younger brother of Nelson, and persuaded him to sponsor and basically to head up this new rival commission. And the argument was it should be trilateral, namely that this isn't just an Atlantic Cold War we're talking about. We need Japan involved in these dialogues. And Bilderberg refused to. The European members of Bilderberg, I guess, were jealous of their time with the Americans and didn't want to let the Japanese in. They did try with Bilderberg first. Having been turned down, Brzezinski convinced Rockefeller there needed to be an alternative. And so the Trilateral Commission was born. All kinds of urban myths have flown both from Bilderberg and the Trilateral Commission, that they're sort of cabals that run the world. These were very worthy and continue to be very worthy sort of fora for discussing, the big geopolitical issues of our time. I think the significance of the Trilateral Commission is who Brzezinski recruited to be its members, and one of whom was a young-ish and not very well-known governor of Georgia, Jimmy Carter.
That actually leads to my next question, which is what explains the relationship between Jimmy Carter and Brzezinski, people who you would actually, on the surface at any rate, think were at the opposite poles in terms of interests family background, education, etc. And how did Brzezinski become Carter's national security advisor?
It's a fascinating relationship, as you say. They're remarkably different kinds of people. Um, Carter, this Southern Baptist, but sort of new Democrat, new South, governor of Georgia, but one who keeps preaching at Sunday school while he's in office, including, by the way, the early months of his presidency. Um, who knew nothing about foreign policy and was aware of his ignorance and wanted to correct that. And so his vehicle, when he was asked by Brzezinski to join the Trilateral Commission, he accepted with alacrity. And Brzezinski became his kind of tutor. Brzezinski gave a rolling over the next few years. This was 1972, a rolling crash course in the big foreign policy issues of the time. And Brzezinski, was a difficult character, but the one sort of area where I, in my research, never heard negative feedback, only praise, was from students. People loved his teaching style. It was exacting, demanding, and quite dynamic, whether it was Harvard or Columbia. And Carter became essentially his student, and indeed he when he ran for eventually for the presidency, setting up basically a permanent camp in Iowa in 1975, he repeatedly declared, "I am an eager student of Zbig." Now, that's all he needed to say. And the fact that the word Zbig, was immediately understood by people because Brzezinski was known as the Democratic Party's Kissinger, it tells you a lot about the salience and prominence of grand strategists at that stage in American history. And when Carter became president, he kept saying, "I'm an eager student of Zbig." And there was this wonderful note I came across where Brzezinski wrote to the president, wrote to Carter, "I think you should probably stop referring to yourself as my eager student. The American people want a leader as president, not a student." And Carter scribbled okay in the margins. But they were, this Sunday school preacher Democrat who promised Americans he would never lie to them, which was very salient in the post-Watergate moment. And this Machiavellian Polish American, who took no prisoners when he argued, and he did argue. It was a very unlikely, but a remarkably productive, and for the most part, very cordial relationship between a president and his national security advisor. Quite different to Kissinger-Nixon, which was psychologically quite complex, but also to Bush Senior and Brett Scowcroft, which was another very close relationship between a president and his national security advisor. Was something unique about the Carter-Brzezinski relationship that I think sort of stands out as one of the most unusual presidential relationships in history.
How would you rate Brzezinski as national security advisor? Would you say he was good or even better than, say, Kissinger?
I did interview Kissinger a fair bit for this biography. Kissinger outlived Brzezinski by, I think, 6 years. He died in 2023. Brzezinski died in 2017. And so he was very cooperative. I asked him that question: where would you rate Brzezinski as a strategist? So slightly broader question. And Kissinger said he would put him in the top 2, which I didn't feel I needed to press who he thought was number 1. But I would rate him. I mean, the national security advisors have 2 roles, really. One is to advise the president, and the other is to be an honest broker. the sort of air traffic controller, if you like, between the various great federal departments of state, defense, treasury, etc., and the intelligence agencies. And I think on the first, on the advice that Brzezinski gave Carter, he was Carter's first meeting every morning at 7:30 a.m. for 30 to 60 minutes every day of his presidency, barring Sundays, or where one of them, was traveling. But pretty much 95% of Carter's days began with Brzezinski and mostly ended with Brzezinski. And his advice was exceptionally good. I think if you look at it in retrospect, highly controversial at the time. But his role as an honest broker, I think, was less good. I think he was unable to be neutral between his view of what Carter should do in terms of the Soviet Union and the Cold War in general, and what Cy Vance, Carter's Secretary of State, was advising. They clashed, and Vance sort of believed that because Brzezinski put covering notes on everything that the State Department sent to the president, including, the minutes of National Security Council meetings that Vance chaired, that Brzezinski was not being neutral, and he was sort of advocating his own views. So I would rate him as top rank in terms of strategic brain. Not so good in terms of honest broker.
Actually, it leads to my next question, which is, who is primarily at fault about the poor state of relations between Brzezinski and the State Department?
It was, really Carter, I think, for having two people with very, very radically different ideas of how to handle the Cold War. And never really deciding between them. And eventually he went for Brzezinski, mostly because events led him in that direction. But first and foremost, having these two men appointed to the two key positions, was destined to produce a sort of running civil war within the administration. And that's what happened. Vance was one of the last of the sort of old-fashioned great WASPs. The sort of Anglo-American tradition of public service being a sort of duty rather than a profession. Brzezinski was very much the professional, and wore his ambition on his sleeve. But they clashed sort of fundamentally on on whether détente should be revived, which was of course a product of Kissinger-Nixon. Or whether the Soviet Union should be sort of pushed back on its heels, this being the first presidency for many, many administrations that did not have the Vietnam War albatross hanging around its neck. And Brzezinski felt that the US should take the ideological offensive back to the Soviets through human rights. And through contesting, the alleged Soviet adventurism in places like the Horn of Africa, Central America, and of course, ultimately with the invasion of Afghanistan. And I think, events really pushed Carter towards Brzezinski's worldview, because Carter just lost any faith that he could really have an honest and productive dialogue with the Soviets, given all the adventurism. And then, as a corollary of that, the human rights, the Helsinki agreement, that Brzezinski really picked up the human rights element of it, that the Soviets had signed a thing. They thought it was an empty pledge, but he said, no, this is a pledge you have signed. It's a sort of binding treaty here. That you permit freedom of movement, freedom of expression, freedom of religion. And there were all these figures who were sort of inspired by that, Andrei Sakharov being the sort of probably the most famous dissident, but groups within, across the Eastern Bloc, like Solidarity in Poland, like the Helsinki Watch groups that grew up in almost every country, the civic action groups in the Czechoslovakian Republic, And for Vance, this was just dangerous stuff. It was provoking the Soviet Union. It was jeopardizing détente, and it was making it less likely that he would be able to successfully conclude nuclear arms limitation talks, the so-called SALT II agreement. So it was a fundamental sort of clash of views that Carter himself nearly didn't really resolve. He should have fired one of them, but he never could bring himself to. But which events sort of did resolve in Brzezinski's favor.
What would you rate as Brzezinski's greatest successes and failures as national security advisor?
So I think the success is the sort of broader Cold War strategy, which is not just, not just about weaponizing human rights, but and stirring sort of dissent and restiveness inside the Eastern Bloc, but also the idea that he'd had as a scholar, really from as far back as the early 60s, that the Soviets were an aging, uninnovative, stagnant, had a stagnant economy and were really falling behind the Americans. I think, in terms of actual Cold War moves, normalization with China was something Carter said he saw as his greatest achievement, and Brzezinski was the instrument of that normalization. Again, it was something Vance saw as provocative to the Soviets, so Vance was a bitter opponent of normalization. Brzezinski sort of brought it to pass to such an extent that his relationship with Deng Xiaoping, China's leader, when Deng Xiaoping visited America to conclude the normalization of relations between China and the US, the first night that he spent on American soil, which was indeed the first night any Chinese leader in history had ever spent in America, was at Brzezinski's home in McLean, Virginia, not at the White House. That was how close the relationship was. In terms of his failures, clearly Iran, and that became the sort of epitaph, somewhat tragically, of the Carter administration. And Brzezinski very much played his part in that. He, after the Shah had been exiled, the Shah of Iran had been exiled by in the revolution. He joined here. He was on the same page as Kissinger, but he joined those urging Carter to admit the Shah into the United States for medical treatment. But he had lymphoma, terminal lymphoma, on the grounds that he could only receive top quality treatment in the United States, in New York, and that just wasn't true. He could receive and was receiving treatment in many different places, and he didn't need to be in the United States. But even if it were true, Brzezinski failed to see that as a condition of asylum, he ought to have insisted the Shah renounce all claims to the Peacock throne, knowing that, that very same Shah, as a younger man, had been imposed on the throne in an Anglo-American coup in 1953, and that therefore his admittance into the United States would trigger all kinds of Iranian, Persian paranoia about another coup. And sure enough, a few days after the Shah was admitted, the embassy was stormed, and those 52 American diplomats were taken hostage, and that then just became the nightly measure for the next for the next year or two of Carter's impotence.
Why, like Henry Kissinger, was Brzezinski never given a second chance in high office?
He was offered. It didn't go very far, but twice Ronald Reagan tried to recruit Brzezinski as his national security advisor. Neither occasion did Brzezinski really show much interest. He realized that ultimately he was a Democrat. And in fact, when George Shultz, Reagan's Secretary of State, said, why don't you join our side? Brzezinski's response is, because the Democrats need me more. I mean, he was very concerned that it was still a McGovernite party after the, hapless George McGovern, very dovish 1972 presidential campaign where he lost in a landslide to Nixon. And he felt that the Democrats needed flintier or more hard-nosed figures such as him. So he was offered, and of course Kissinger did really bent over backwards to sort of reinvent himself as a Reaganite, but wasn't offered. He wasn't persona non grata in the Reagan world, but he wasn't a big figure. He wasn't somebody Reagan frequently consulted. Then in 1989, after George H.W. Bush defeated Michael Dukakis, and Brzezinski had, for the first time and the last, publicly endorsed the Republican in a race. He really didn't approve of Dukakis. He saw Dukakis as another McGovernite. Bush Sr. offered him ambassadorship to Japan, and I don't think he felt, he wanted to move to Japan at that stage in his life, so he turned it down. But that was the last time he was offered a formal job, in American politics.
How was Brzezinski able in 1988 to predict the downfall of the Soviet Empire in Central and Eastern Europe?
He wrote this book, it was a wonderful little book called Grand Failure. It came out in 88. I guess he'd been writing it in 86, 87, in which, he goes into all the things that we've discussed, namely the sort of rising nationalist sentiments, the moribund and highly indebted nature of the Soviet economies, also communist economies, and the fact that people were trying to leave. It was sort of game over in his view by then. The system just couldn't sustain itself. He did in that book, and it's one of his best sort of it's a small book, but it's a very succinct one. And he really skewers the record of Bolshevism, and particularly, describes the Soviet Union as a museum to the industrial age. It had fallen so far behind. But the one exception he made to that, he said China's not going to collapse. China, is a much more coherent nation state. There might be minorities like, Tibetans and Uyghurs, but they're a fairly small share of the population. But more to the point, it was dynamic economically. There was a sort of state-led capitalism in China that he believed would make it the exception from this grand funeral that he was writing, this epitaph of the communist era. And I think, again, on that one, he was prescient.
Why, strangely enough, was he opposed to Ukraine's joining NATO?
He wanted Ukraine to be Finlandized. It was uncharacteristic, and even more so, Kissinger wanted Ukraine to join NATO. So they kind of swapped their clothes, both towards the ends of their life. Brzezinski wrote that. It's actually an op-ed for my newspaper, the Financial Times. He wrote that in 2014 after Putin had annexed Crimea, and I think he felt that if Ukraine was to survive, it would have to avoid war. I attribute some of this to just Brzezinski having sort of got older and maybe a little bit softer, because this is not what you would expect him to say. And in Kissinger's case, even when he was 98, 99, he wanted to retain access, and the fashion then, the consensus then in 2023 was that Ukraine should join NATO. But they were, you're right, uncharacteristic positions for each man.
If you wanted people to take one thing away from your book, Edward Luce, what would it be?
I guess that the making of a strategist is a story. It's a process. The formative years is always look at the formative years. of somebody. They give you the key. And Brzezinski was a grand strategist. But if there's one thing I would say to take away is pay attention. He is underappreciated in history, and I think it's belated that a book such as mine is now available.
On that observation, which I would like to agree with entirely, I'd like to thank you very much, Edward Luce, for being so kind as to speak with us today. This is Charles Statiel. You've been listening to New Books in History, a podcast channel on the New Books Network. Thank you, Edward Luce, very much.
Thank you. It was a great pleasure.